Thinking about it, the fact that I've been playing Sonic the Hedgehog games for over 33 years now is probably the cause for some sort of celebration. Speaking of which, in 2011, in celebration of Sonic the Hedgehog's 20th birthday, Sega and Sonic Team released Sonic Generations. The game was a greatest hits of sorts, combining reimagined stages from Sonic's mainline games from the prior 2 decades with modern Sonic-style boost gameplay and an all-new classic Sonic experience in the vein of the original games. 13 years later, this anniversary pack is seeing its own celebration, and while the prospect of a remastered Sonic Generations is interesting, it's the addition of an entirely new Shadow the Hedgehog specific campaign that's the real draw. Does this package deliver on a premiere Sonic experience with a substantial Shadow story? Hi, I'm Dan the Mega Driver, and this is my review of Sonic X Shadow Generations from the eyes of a Sonic fan who has followed the series for over 3 decades. Sonic X Shadow Generations is available this Friday at the time of this video airing, though if you've pre-purchased the Digital Deluxe Edition, like we did, you could play it from the 22nd of October. Yes, to make it clear in this video, the SEGAGuys purchased their own copy of Sonic X Shadow Generations as no review code was provided. Personally, I first played Sonic Generations back when it was released in 2011. At the time, I was a PC gamer primarily, but I did get a copy, or free eventually, on the Xbox 360. I utterly adored Sonic's 20th anniversary celebration on the first go around, clocking up 40 hours of playtime. If you saw my video from back in June where I expressed my hopes and fears for this package, you may recall that I felt that the gameplay from Generations was showing its age a little bit, and that the graphical upgrades on this remake didn't seem substantial. After spending some time with the game, I am pleased to report that there are some changes and improvements to differentiate it from the original. But of course, the main draw of this collection is the Shadow Generations campaign, an all-new story that effectively doubles the length of the game. Booting this game up on PC, you get the option of choosing Sonic Generations or Shadow Generations. Both have their own separate options and menu screens, and are presented as 2 entirely different games in a collection of sorts, not entirely dissimilar to Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy. Let's look at Sonic Generations first. Sonic Generations is a game that I am very familiar with. Despite its 4-hour main story, I spent 10 times that length on the PC version alone back in the day, and having beaten it just last year on the Xbox before the announcement, a lot of its design details are still stuck with me. There's things that have changed, and there's things that stay the same, and sometimes the two clash and make very little sense, to be honest. I mean, right off the bat, Omochao tells you that if you lose your rings and you get hit, you lose a life. Slight problem with that, there's no lives in Sonic Generations now. The game has been retooled to reflect the modern day infinite lives approach. This does take the pressure off somewhat, but it feels like it's a little dialed back in difficulty as a result, since the game is much easier than, say, Sonic Superstars. This also means that all extra life power-ups have been removed and or replaced, which, funnily enough, is noticeable less than a minute after Omochao's line about extra lives. 2 things stick out here. First is that Sonic Team must have gone through every stage and moved all of the extra lives, but seemingly, aside from adding the Chao hunts, didn't touch anything else. And secondly, Omochao is apparently the only character who didn't have its lines re-recorded, which is pretty insane given it speaks more than anyone else in the game. And yes, the dialogue. Let's talk about that now and get this controversial topic out of the way. Sonic Generations features remastered cutscenes with rewritten dialogue penned by Ian Flynn and re-recorded lines. This has caused something of a stir in the Sonic community. 2 of the most obvious changes are that Sonic no longer shoves Amy in the face in the opening sequence, and Knuckles no longer asks Classic Sonic if he's put on weight.
Thanks, Sonic. You did a good job back there. Hey, did you gain weight?
The weight one, in my opinion, is kinda silly, especially since the original animations are retained. It looks a little off, and the actions don't align with what's being said. The Amy one, I can kind of understand. You can't go around shoving girls in the face now, come on. I do get the concerns about preservation and artistic integrity, really I do. And thankfully, the original Sonic Generations is still out there in the physical form on Xbox 360 and PS3. It's still available on Steam in reasonably priced bundles and is compatible with modern Xbox consoles. It still looks good and plays well, so it's not something that we can say has been lost. Personally, I do think that the new dialogue is a net positive. Sonic referring to old games and concepts like the Time Stones, which he didn't do before, makes it a more authentic experience. And let's be real here, Flynn knows his Sonic lore. I'm not going to dwell on it any more than that in this video. It's a complex issue. Preservation and artistic integrity is definitely a concern. But on the whole, the changes in this are for the better, at least in my opinion, and people are entitled to theirs as well. With that out of the way, let's focus on the rest of Sonic Generations. The game structure is exactly as it was 13 years ago. There are 9 recreated zones from previous Sonic games, before 2011 that is. Each has 2 acts, one with classic Sonic and one with modern Sonic. You beat them, then you beat the challenges around them to get the boss keys that allow you to fight the 3 main bosses and 3 sub-bosses, and then there's the final Super Sonic fight. Stage design is identical, that is, aside from the aforementioned removal of the 1-ups. You also get the inclusion of the Chow Rescue, which amounts to basically more collectibles, but this is a nicer version and the Chows are extremely charming, especially as you pick them up and they hover about. There are other improvements. The graphics are improved just slightly, and the graphical options really do allow more flexibility on PC than ever before, with the ability to run at higher frame rates being one of the most welcome, at least in my opinion. Gameplay has been tweaked too, allowing for controls that feel closer to Sonic Frontiers. It's still mostly the generations that you'll remember, but remapping buttons and adding the drop dash for example, do make it feel that little bit fresher. And given that I noticed some input lag when I was playing the Xbox 360 game on Series X, it's great to report that this feels like it's completely gone from the remaster. Overall, this is a solid version of a great game, with none of the issues that came with the Sonic Colors remaster. But of course, the biggest addition is the new Shadow Generations campaign. Now, I'm a bit of a Shadow the Hedgehog apologist. I really like the 2005 Shadow the Hedgehog game. I mean, it's basically just Sonic Adventure 2, but with Shadows levels only, more stages, objectives, and guns. What's there not to like? Anyway, like many others, I've enjoyed Shadow the Hedgehog and thought that he was a compelling character and a worthwhile addition to the Sonic universe. As such, getting to play his greatest hits in the same way and style as the Sonic campaign is very welcome. Admittedly, in my video from back in June, I said that I didn't actually have higher hopes for the campaign, expecting it to be some sort of redux of Sonic's story, minus a classic Sonic, and about half the runtime. But good golly, I was pretty wrong about this. You have the option of a quick recap of Shadow the Hedgehog's story, summarising his origins and a few of the events from the game since. When you start the game, you're on the Space Colony arc from Sonic Adventure 2, investigating a strange signal. It feels like it starts in media res, but it actually follows on from the absolutely stellar animated series that's currently showing on Sonic's official YouTube channel. What I loved about the intro is how it ties Shadow's story with Sonic's. It was never overtly stated in the promotional material or the trailers, but it did appear that Black Doom from 2005's Shadow the Hedgehog video game would be the main antagonist. But here he's merely taken advantage of the work that the Time Eater is undertaking, who coincidentally appears in the cinematic to tie everything together. And yes, later on, Sonic and Shadow's paths cross quite differently to the original game. Shadow's game is structured similarly to Sonic's, with classic zones that play over 2 acts, with later additional challenges that must be completed in order to unlock a boss. Defeat that and then you can progress. One of the things that sets it apart is that the scale and the scope of the fractured time area, or white space as it's called, is very different. Unlike Sonic's hub, Shadow's is fully 3D and it's pretty impressive how it's all put together, maintaining the same look and feel but with the extra dimension providing greater scope for exploration. The visuals are fantastic, filled with colour, but maintaining enough of that brooding sepia-tinged feel at times to feel on brand for Shadow. That in itself is quite a fantastic feat. Music too is simply astounding. I mean, every Sonic game has amazing music, right? It's got remix themes from the original games, all new music that feels completely on brand, and a bunch of classic unlockable tracks that you can choose to also play during your gameplay. Similar to Sonic, Shadow has one act that's fully 3D, and another act that plays like a 2D or 2.5D game. That said, the physics and movesets are identical in both. It's just the stage design that differs, unlike the clear line that separates classic and modern Sonic gameplay, which makes sense considering there's only one Shadow in this story. Speaking of gameplay then, I'm not going to mince words here, it's fantastic. Whereas Sonic Generations is constrained by the original game's design and tries to squeeze in modern Sonic Frontiers style control methods, Shadow by contrast is a fresh canvas, where it very much feels like an evolution of the Sonic Frontiers control formula but built around the essence of Shadow the Hedgehog. The impactful and heavy combat feel of Frontiers feels perfect for Shadow, and this feels, to me, the best that Sonic or Shadow have played in a 3D game. Like Frontiers, Shadow's moveset is augmented by a litany of different abilities. These are all unique and, in the spirit of the character, making sense from a narrative and aesthetic sense. My favourite is the ability to smack Black Arms monsters, pummel them in a direction of your choosing and teleport over to them, breaking walls or accessing areas that you couldn't reach normally. It really opens the world up. Crucially, the main action stages too. And as for the stages themselves, they're spectacular, extremely well designed and evocative of Shadow's escapades over the last 23 years. Like Sonic back in 2011, some of the stages can just floor you with just how good they are compared to the originals. Kingdom Valley, for instance, from Sonic 2006 is utterly spellbinding, the magic of the environment fully realised in a game light years better than 06. The Sonic Forces stage, which it must be said feels like a bit of an outlier as one of two stages from games that came out after 2011, also feels so much better than the original stage. I felt that Shadow's campaign felt more challenging than Sonic's, but it never feels unfair. There's plenty of skill checks and it does an excellent job of teaching you how to use Shadow's skills and abilities, and as such feels as satisfying as any 3D Sonic game ever has. What's great is that the stages aren't just linear retreads. Even more than Sonic, the game isn't afraid to mix things up. Certain acts will mix into a warped radical highway, for example. The Bio-Lizard boss has a bunch of new attacks that make the battle feel fresh and exciting, and Shadow's new abilities really sing in the new stage designs. This means that Shadow Generations somehow achieves its lofty ambitions. It somehow feels fresh despite being a brilliant nostalgia trip. It proves to be a substantial additional campaign almost as long as the main game, especially as while there are less acts and challenges, they are longer and slightly more difficult. And on top of that, the game excels at being endlessly replayable. Even on your first playthrough, the scope for faster and more efficient routes is abundantly clear, and the realisation of new powers makes those levels well worth revisiting, especially as you hunt for those unlockables and chase those S ranks. The story though didn't quite hit the spot for me. For all the callbacks, with some that are, admittedly, truly special, they still didn't quite hit the mark. Shadow's story should be heavy on nostalgia, and for some it may be, but despite being with Shadow since the start, I felt it all came across a little flat. That may just be me though, and for newcomers especially, this is a great whistle-stop tour of Shadow's story as the time for the new movie ticks down. The full Shadow campaign is around 3 hours long. That's just under the length of Sonic's and effectively doubles the size of the package. It is an absolutely excellent game, but whether the short length means that it's worth the price of admission alone is questionable. If you're happy to hunt for all the extra items and chase the highest grades, playing the game over and over, then the lower than average price with the remastered Sonic Generations in tow is probably worth it. If you're not interested in the Sonic Generations remaster, it becomes a bit of a harder sell, even at the lower price. But despite its short length, Shadow Generations is still an absolutely fantastic game and can stand proudly as one of the best in the series. You just end up wanting a bit more. Overall, given that I was worried that this game may disappoint, I'm pleased to report that overall it's a great package that's easy to recommend to Sonic fans. Sonic Generations was always one of the better 3D Sonic games, and while this isn't a substantial improvement, it's better in the small ways that matter, discarding the controversial cutscene changes of course. I can't tell you how many Sonic games I have played since 1991, but it's a lot, many of which I've beaten multiple times. So it's a big deal for me to say that this is one of the best. It's not quite up there with the original 8 and 16-bit games, or Frontiers, or the adventure games in my opinion, but it's close. With a project of this scale, that is, Shadow's whole new campaign created in just the last couple of years since Frontiers, that really bodes well for the future. And for this veteran Sonic fan, for the first time in decades, the future of Sonic the Hedgehog has never looked brighter. If you've played or are looking to play Sonic Cross Shadow Generations, let us know in the comments below or on the SEGAGuys Discord. And if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop a like and a subscribe as that really helps the channel. Until next time, This has been Dan, the Mega Driver of the Sega Guys, and we will see you on the Sega side.